Hi folks, if you want to start taking your seats, I think we're going to begin very, very shortly.
Yes.
Oh, hello.
Come on in, folks. You want a seat? Sir, do you want a seat? I would love it. You need it. Come on up. Come on up. Don't be shy. Here we go. Okay. Come on in.
There is lots of room. There's some room here at the front. All right, guys. Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mira Patney, Head of Global Communications at Semafor. Thank you for being with us this morning. How great is it to be at a winery at 8 a.m.? I love it. I hope some of us can stay for the rest of the day and have a couple drinks. It is a Wednesday. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Semafor's event on fixing America's supply chain crisis. As many of you guys know, COVID-19 has exposed the limitations of global supply chains to respond to major crises, from transportation bottlenecks to labor shortages. We now obviously understand the scale of those stress points and, most importantly, their cause and effect. Rising inflation today is also putting the spotlight on some of the same challenges experienced during the early months of the pandemic, specifically access and affordability. Well, this morning, we are bringing together some of the most influential lawmakers, government officials, and industry experts from the private and public sectors to explore and examine positive and proactive solutions that can help to make our supply chains more resilient and globally competitive. Our event is being live streamed today at semafor.com. It's right there at the back, and on our Twitter and YouTube channels. You can follow us on Twitter at Semafor and use the hashtag #FixSupplyChains to join the conversation. Before we begin, a very special thank you to the Consumer Brands Association. We are so grateful for their partnership on this event. So let's get started. Our first guest is a leading voice in Congress for bipartisan supply chain legislation. Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She's also the author of the Building Resilient Supply Chains Act, which establishes a new office in the Department of Commerce focusing on improving the functioning of supply chains. Joining her on stage for a conversation today is my favorite person, Semafor's editor-at-large, Steve Clemens. Steve, over to you.
Mira, thank you. You have so many favorite persons, but I'm glad to be one of them. Mira, thank you. Congressman Blunt Rochester, we have talked about so many issues, but I think this is the first on the supply chain crisis. I think if we were together a few years ago, no one would have showed up, even if we had had avocado toast, right? So, and I want to point out, Christy Rogers, my friend Christy Rogers from Principal to Principal here, she had a huge forum yesterday on supply chain crisis. My friend Jeff Carneal with Project 44. Many of you are engaged in the supply chain questions right now because, and I'm just to ask you, why has this topic become so compelling and important and sort of one of the top issues that you're focused on?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really weird, as you said, that like supply chain is now like a buzzword. Like everybody knows this now that might not have known it before.
If you had run on supply chain, you wouldn't have gotten anywhere, right? Yeah.
But guess what?
Yeah.
I ran on supply chains this election, and people actually, it resonated with people. And I think one of the things that we tried to do was make it really practical in real life and help people understand why are the cost of things going up? Why is it taking so long to get things? And so for me, I'm on the health subcommittee in addition to energy and environment and climate change. And on the health subcommittee, from the beginning of the pandemic, we saw you couldn't get masks. People were wearing trash bags for PPE. Then I went out to visit my business community, different businesses, and they were talking about the price of lumber and how it was hard to get it, and then that increased the cost of housing. And then we actually went to a car dealership. There were no cars because there were no chips. We went to a distillery that made vodka and gin. They didn't have bottles or labels. They had to reconfigure everything that they did. And so what we found, baby formula. I mean,
what happened there?
Chicken nuggets in the schools.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't not have chicken nuggets like in a school. And so we just started seeing this connection and also saw an opportunity for us as a country to think about our competitiveness, our national security, our future. I started a bipartisan future work caucus in Congress because, again, we've got to do these things together. It's really important for us. And so this really resonated with my constituents. And for me, it was both practical and personal. Even going to a coffee shop, there was a sign that said, we have no pastries because of supply chain issues. And I'm like, supply chain? And so, again, that's not the reason why I got into it for pastries, but it really did affect every single industry that we were dealing with.
So you're the author of the Building Resilient Supply Chains Act, which was one of the acts that was kind of trying to nudge in to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And I don't know who the villain was who kept it from getting there. So if you want to disclose why it didn't go, but why? So tell us about the act, but why would anyone block a kind of, I mean, tell us what you're trying to do and who is opposed to bringing that element into the NDAA?
Well, first of all, we were able to get on the conference committee for America. We got it into America Competes in the House, and the Senate and the House have been working on the different provisions, and we were successful in getting the CHIPS and Science Bill passed. And I don't want us to forget the things that we did accomplish because they were major. And we have caucus meetings, which actually one starts at 9 o'clock. And I typically don't speak up in those caucus meetings because literally people are texting and live tweeting what's happening in the room. But I was so compelled to stand up and tell my colleagues we have to focus on supply chains and also on our competitiveness, that I made the pledge and the point in one of our meetings. And we were able to get on that conference committee. We were able to get some things done. And just so you know what the bill does, it creates, first of all, a central office in the Department of Commerce that will be responsible for looking at everything from our gaps, our breaks, fixing our supply chains and making sure that we're mapping and monitoring them, and also providing loans and grants to make sure that we onshore and nearshore businesses home in America. And so this bill had bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. As it relates to the most recent NDAA, I mean, I think it was a victim as many other things that people wanted to attach onto that vehicle. There had to be agreement that we could get this NDAA passed. But what I am confident and hopeful about is the fact that the conversations haven't stopped. The fact that you're even having a session on this is proof that we recognize, whether it's food, whether it's logistics, but all of this is important.
Yesterday I happened
to... Now, you might know who killed it. Maybe that's why you asked me.
No, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I ask questions I don't know the answers to occasionally. Sometimes I do. But yesterday I interviewed Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's going to be the incoming chair for the Energy and Commerce Committee. And she made a really interesting point, because I was sort of thinking in advance of the supply chain crisis, what are the missing blind spots in the conversation? And I asked her, and she said, for her, she opposed the CHIPS Act, not because she doesn't think we should be investing in chips, because he said there are other parts of the ecosystem that we're not thinking through. For her, it's the fact that we've got a lot of money now in the CHIPS Act, but we haven't solved the permitting problem. We're not going to be able to build these places within the time. So permitting within that was one element of it. Another part are things like the supply chain ecosystem, and she says we're not taking a holistic view. Would you agree with her on that?
I would agree with her. That's why the conference committee came together, and it was a very comprehensive approach that we were trying to take. But we also had, I would say, urgent needs. Chips are an urgent need. I mean, I visited a company in Delaware that make the mammogram machines. They showed me the board that requires multiple chips and what they had to do while they didn't have those chips. It's our health, it's our wealth, it's our national security. And so that was important for that moment, but I'm glad to hear that she, like I do, feel this conversation has to continue. And she will be the chairperson of our committee, Energy and Commerce, and we had a large part to play in this.
One of the other elements is this, the missing worker in America, right? So let's be honest. I mean, there's something that has happened that, from the period of pre-COVID to now, in terms of labor shortages, in terms of a massive labor need in America to fill this gap. And we've seen it in the issues about the railways and managing them and the potential strike, which seems to have been averted, I think. Yeah. But on that side, what is the thinking among your colleagues? Because part of it is rationality in logistics systems, and there are lots of people here. But at one level, are we just going to have to automate and get rid of people, or is there a people way to do it if you don't have the folks to man the ships and the planes and the systems?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I remember a couple of months ago, I was in the elevator in the Longworth office building in the Capitol, and I heard one of the interns say, yeah, my major is logistics. And I was like, we never thought to have that as a major. But now, again, supply chains, logistics, these are new things. And even in Delaware, we have a program called Pathways to Prosperity, which starts in middle school, goes to high school, and kids can then go to college or go right to a job.
Right.
And they just created a pathway just for logistics. And so I think one is looking at our workforce and how we do things. I was Secretary of Labor in Delaware and head of state personnel. And I think that we need to take this moment to not do things the way we always did them, and to be thinking creatively. People left the workforce because of COVID, but many women didn't come back. We have a child care problem in this country. You know, we have a training issue in this country. We have a flexibility and thinking about how people want to live their lives now. Many people retired, and some people just said, I don't want to do that kind of work anymore. And so for me, that's why I focused on the future of work before we even had the pandemic, because we saw automation coming. And I think instead of going backwards, we need to lean forward.
You voted to avert the rail strike. Was that a tough vote?
You know, for me, you're weighing different things. And I'm a strong believer in labor. I mean, even on our bill for the supply chain bill, I had roundtables with labor so that it was, we had the chamber, we had the business roundtable, but we also had labor at the table. So I'm a strong believer in labor, but I also know that for the greater good of our country, we could not have that rail strike. And we did partner and have conversations. And I think the president, I think the administration, and I think we in Congress did the right thing at this time.
I'm going to ask you one more quick one, and I'm going to go to the audience group. We're moving very quickly here, so Christy, get ready, because I promised you the first question. So we've also seen that food prices have been going up. It's supply demand, and if you don't have the supply, it's going to go up. And yesterday we had 7.1% inflation. People applauded that in a way, and the markets applauded that. Do you think that supply and demand are beginning to come back into gear, or is this going to be a longer-term problem that Americans are going to still see the price of food products, the price of baby formula, the price of toilet paper, all of this stuff continue to rise because of the shortages that still remain out there?
I mean, I think,
and logistics issues too.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be solved tomorrow. I think that the numbers gave us hope. But I do think it's so complicated when you think about everything from a war in Ukraine and what impact that has on things like food. When you think about the fact that the good news is that we have jobs and that wages are going up, but that also means that goods, the price of goods could go up. And so I don't think it's going to be a short-term fix. But I do think that us focusing on things like supply chains and making sure that we as a country...
Are you going to bring the Building Resilient Supply Chains Act back in the next Congress?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So very early. We'll expect to see it very early.
Very, very early.
It's drafted, done, get it in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Christy
So
Rogers,
that might be a nice applause line right there. We're bringing it back.
Yeah, okay, great.
We're bringing it back.
Let's go to Christy Rogers, who's also working with Principal Principals. Christy? Yeah.
You got it? Okay.
Quick, yeah.
Well, good morning. Thank you. And thank you so very much for all the work and the focus that you're doing on this. We've been running a global supply chain task force since March of 2020, so the beginning of the pandemic. And honestly, we started with Chairman Peters in the Senate and Ranking Member Portman calling us up saying, how the heck can we get more masks? What can we do for pharmaceuticals? And how can we help streamline some of these supply chains? So we focused on that at first and then moved to semiconductors and are now on critical minerals, rare earths, and met with a big forum, as Steve said yesterday, with Department of Energy, Commerce, and the White House, as well as Canada and Mexico and a few in South America.
So why didn't you just fix it yesterday?
So it's very complicated. We've
Yeah.
spent 3 decades, we, the collectively, pushing our manufacturing overseas.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, uncertainty in the tax code, high regulation, and cheaper labor.
Right.
Yes.
It's going to take us a while to fix it. So my
Right.
question for you, now I would love to talk to you about building resiliency supply chains back.
Right.
Is there a missing component, and how can we help you in the Office at Commerce to actually really
Right.
monitor the supply chains, identify the vulnerabilities, particularly in our critical goods? What can we do, and what can industry do to help you sort of move that forward?
I
Great
love that
question.
question. First of all, in the language, we specifically mention monitoring and mapping. And what I would encourage you to do is keep the pressure on. I will tell you, the reason I believe that the CHIPS and Science Bill got done was not necessarily because of what we were saying and doing in Congress, but what you were doing. And I really hope that people will keep the pressure on. That's one of the reasons that I was glad to be invited here and to see that it's standing room only, because it cuts across demographic, it cuts across the country. It's affecting all of us. So please keep the pressure on. Speak to legislators, speak to Democrats and Republicans, and leadership. I'm grateful that Kathy is one of the people who's also a believer in this, but keep the pressure on. That's my advice.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Blunt Rochester from
Thank
Delaware.
you.
Thank you very, very much. Great to see you. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Okay, Dusty. Hey, and I should tell you all have permission to crawl over, folks, to get to the 5 chairs over here.
Yeah, we're gonna
so
try and
feel
move
free.
people a little bit up
I know
front.
the avocado toasted, but please come on in and feel free to take a seat. Hey, Fran Harden and everybody, just help open up, let people. Hey, ladies, come on in. You can go, and Fran will let you in. And oh no, Fran, you don't have to move. No, I just want you to let people in there. Yeah, come on in.
Couple
I'm
of
not-
seats up here
I'm
in the
not
front.
moving you, my dear. Okay. Would any more of you like seats? Come on in. Come take them. The great seats right in here. Hey, Eric Beal, move over to the left near Christy. There we go. Move left. Come on up. Come on up. Okay, I made seats for you, so come on. Feel free to take them. Don't be shy. Okay.
Well, that was
Mira.
a fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve, for doing that. You're just wonderful at these things. Well, thank you, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester. Up next, he's here already. Another leader from the House, this time from the other side of the aisle, Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota, is a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. His bill, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which was introduced in 2021, was a timely move to crack down on international ocean shipping costs and ease backlogs. He's already here. Welcome into the stage again. And Steve, over to you.
See you. Representative Johnson, it's great to see you, and thanks for joining us. You know, you are a congressman obsessed with logistics and connecting the price. I love the fact
That's
that
a very sexy description.
Yeah, I mean, you're behind
Obsessed
the
with logistics.
Ocean Shipping Reform Act. How much ocean does South Dakota border?
Yeah, people would often ask why the largest reformed maritime law in a generation came from South Dakota, right? But the reality is that 60% of South Dakota's soybeans are exported overseas, along with a tremendous amount of beef and dairy and corn. And I think it's just a good reminder to all of us, you all know, but some of my constituents didn't, that this is an incredibly interconnected global economy, and everybody needs to care about maritime law.
So tell me about what your constituents are feeling, because I mean, part of what I'm trying to get at is why supply chain is connected to inflation, is connected to supply-demand questions, and how does an economy that is so market-based in its DNA solve these big structural problems without creating other problems?
Well, and I'm a big believer in the free market, but I would tell you that that's actually part of the challenge in building resiliency into these supply chains, right? Smart companies have optimized supply chains for efficiency as opposed to resiliency. Now, you can optimize for resiliency, but when things are good, there is no bottom line in that, right? Nobody really pays you for being optimized to withstand a shock if there isn't a shock. And I think that is one of the benefits of something like the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, Steve. It sent a clear message to the foreign flagged ocean carriers that they needed to pay attention to their American shippers, even if that wasn't at any given day of the year the most highly profitable thing for them to do. There were some basic minimum standards they needed to engage in.
Do you agree with Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers that
Always, anytime.
Well, I think part of the question is, are we getting it wrong where we're basically looking at a silver bullet like the CHIPS Act, but then we're neglecting other dimensions of the ecosystem, whether it's permitting around that, which I thought we were talking about permitting in energy areas, but she was talking about permitting in other dimensions of the economy, like chip factories, and also looking at the broad side of, with what Lisa Blunt Rochester wants to do in terms of looking at supply chain resilience and beginning to rationalize some of our data and information around that. Should Congress be doing more along both lines of what Lisa Blunt Rochester suggested and Kathy McMorris Rogers?
Of course, I mean, this is a serious problem that would require, to solve it, a comprehensive approach, but that's not really how Congress works. That's really not how any organization works. At some point, incrementalism is what ultimately gets the job done, and I think we want to be attentive to try to eat one piece of this elephant at a time. I think we're all aware that the single biggest barrier to additional investment in this country is workforce.
Right.
And that is, I think the solutions there are relatively straightforward, but politically can be difficult to land.
So what is the problem? What is the way to fix the workforce problem?
Well, first off, before I get to immigration, I would tell you we still have a fair number of Americans on the sidelines. And I think there are a number of things that government has done to make it easier for them to stay on the sidelines. And and I don't want to disagree with Lisa Blunt Rochester. She's right on so many things, and clearly we do have a daycare problem in this country, and I think we can do some things to address that. But by and large, it's not women who are falling short. At any given day in this country, there are more women that have jobs than men. And the workforce participation rate among women in this country has gone up almost unabated for 40 years. That is not the case with men. And frankly, I think we need to do more from a job requirement or a training requirement policy. If people are going to be on some of our safety net programs, which we need, I think we need to hold them accountable for doing what they can to make sure that they can get out of poverty permanently. You cannot escape poverty without a job as a part of that equation. There's no other recipe. And I think the workforce participation rates in this country in the last 10 years suggest that maybe society writ large doesn't fully embrace that idea.
You voted to avert the railroad strike also, like Lisa Blunt Rochester, but you said it was embarrassing that Congress was even involved in this. What did you mean by that?
The side should have worked this out. I don't relish the idea that Congress would inject itself into labor negotiations. That seems not a particularly smart thing to do. Let's take the most dysfunctional deliberative body on the planet and let's involve them, right? But that being said, you would ask Lisa, did you feel good about that vote? If you would have asked me that question, I would have said, yes, that was absolutely the right vote. There was no reasonable alternative. I hate to criticize my colleagues who voted the other way, but are you kidding me? We're really going to, crater the American economy to make some sort of a point, a political point. We're going to crater the American economy because maybe we think this is Joe Biden's problem and he needs to own it. That is utter balderdash. We saw the very real impacts that we felt in this country when toilet paper was in short supply for a little while 2 years ago. We saw the very real impacts in this country's economy when formula was in short supply a year ago and still is in some spaces. This wouldn't be one product in some places in short supply.
Right.
A rail strike for
It's
as little as a few days would have been everything, everywhere.
You are a co-sponsor of the Formula Shortage Reporting Act of 2022, and frankly, I think this is something, probably more than anything else other than toilet paper, where Americans became very, very aware that there was something wrong in the system, and they felt real. You began tweeting pictures of your local markets and whatnot, of things missing on the shelves, and you did this. So I meant to wonder, what is the state of play today with that and this act that you co-sponsored? But as you go into the markets now in South Dakota, are you sensing that things are back to normal now? Are things fragile? I mean, what's the sensitivity and fragility of the provision of these, particularly food items, that Americans encounter when they're out there?
So I'm glad you used the word fragility, because there's two ways to look at this. One is the current state of play, and things are largely back to normal there. You may hear about some spot shortages, but they're pretty limited. But we have not addressed the fundamental problem, which is we still have only 3 facilities that are making this product for the entirety of North America. And it doesn't take a very big hitch in your giddy up before you can see very...
Just want to get that real quick. A hitch in your giddy up?
Giddy up, that's right, Steve. We really
Kind of right up there with acronyms for me.
Yeah, we need to get you out to real America,
yeah.
Steve. This is,
Yeah.
and if you have a very big disruption, even short term, you can get serious problems. And that has not been addressed. And again, it's hard to know how to address it. Is it the federal government's job to go create a 4th baby formula factory competing against the other 3, when maybe what the invisible hand of the market wants is 3? Maybe that's the optimized number for profit. And so I don't have as a free market zealot, I don't have the answer to all these questions. But I would tell you that the fundamental underlying fragility of the system has not been fixed.
This is a picture you tweeted out. You can't all see it here, but the picture of this empty shelf. As Baby found, you did this on November 3rd. So this is what the free market is generating right now, right?
Well, that's not what it's generating today.
Yeah,
that's
right.
what it generated on November 3rd.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is a problem.
Let me ask you another broad thing. It's something that I think we can be, again, this is my own editorial view. We can be reckless when we talk about how easy it is to onshore, what our strategy, I mean, the time involved. That right now, when you sort of take a snapshot of where the supply chain is distributed globally and around the world and how it got there, it was chasing regulatory opportunities, it was chasing environmental standards opportunities one way or another, it was chasing labor rates. And so when you kind of look at bringing all that back, as I talked to many, many producers and manufacturers of transnational firms that want to onshore and bring back capacity. But he said the thing they don't trust in America is price stability or regulatory stability. And they worry about that. And so are we doing a disservice of hyping these topics in such a way that when we come back 2 years from now, we will have achieved very, very little? Because the forces that took us this other direction are very hard to reverse. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and they are very hard to reverse. That being said, I think the still preliminary data, we're kind of early in the post-pandemic environment, but I think there has been a lot of onshoring if you view North America as the shore. I mean, Mexico has been a tremendous beneficiary of people's discomfort or distrust of China particularly. And as people have looked to other Asian countries, particularly Southeastern Asia, they have found it not quite so easy to just pick up and move from China to Vietnam or someplace. But they have had some success doing that. But they've found the regulatory environment in Mexico and the kind of doing business environment in Mexico, as well as the logistical issues related to getting something from Mexico to markets in the United States, a little easier to deal with. You're right, we should not overpromise. We need to understand that the road is rocky and curved ahead of us. But I think it is the right message to send, that we would like to see a lot of that back on this side of the ocean.
And finally, I'm going to go to a question out here, is do you have any counsel for the Biden administration and President Biden's team on how to move more expeditiously than they are on the supply chain crisis?
Yeah, I see a certain cautiousness and a desire to not break too many eggs. And I get it. Politics is a messy business, and I'm sitting in the cheap seats, right? I'm a Republican, and I mean, I won by 60 points, okay? And I get it. I'm adorable, really, but...
And you're the only representative from South Dakota, right?
I'm it. They've all they
you're
got.
more you're more popular than the senators.
Yeah,
there are 2 senators.
Well, that's not that hard to do right now, but... No, and so I get it. He's dealing with a more fractious political environment than I am. But you've got to be kidding me. I mean, it takes 5 years to permit the same project in this country that Italy and France do in 2 years. I would suggest to you that Italy and France are not the paragons of regulatory efficiency.
Right.
And when they are lapping us, that should be a source of American embarrassment. And so Mayor Pete, who I have respect for, he will come to the Transportation Committee and he will say the right things. And then when it actually comes to solution sets where we're trying to find where the Venn diagrams overlap. Right. The solutions, Steve, are so pedestrian and underwhelming. You just know they're not going to make a real change. I mean, it's time to make people a little nervous with some of these suggestions. And not just, it's easy for Biden to want to irritate the right, But if he really wants to be a change agent, if he really wants to transform the American economy in a way that will pay multi-generational dividends, let's make everybody a little uncomfortable.
Great. Let me go to Jeff Carneal. Oh, right here. Let's go to this gentleman right here.
Hi, good morning, Congressman. Carrie Davis from the American Association of Port Authorities.
Oh,
So our 80 some
Are you
odd
in South
ports
Dakota too?
Well, none in South Dakota, but of course, 90 some odd % of everything coming in and out of your state is coming through our seaports.
Right.
Thanks for your work on ocean shipping reform.
Right.
With a lot of negotiation, we backed that bill. Those big old containers on that photo behind you, the flow of those things around our country, coming in and out of the country, are going to increase anywhere from 10 to 50% over the next 30 years. Stepping out, how do we plan for increased trade volumes? Where do we make investments? Is it a labor issue solely?
Right.
How do we make those investments?
Great, thank you.
Well, first off, I would tell you, South Dakota is not a heavily unionized state, and so the last 4 years I've learned a lot more about unions than I knew just growing up in South Dakota. And I would tell you, early on in the port issue, I thought that maybe the unions would be a problem. They absolutely weren't. Every time I met with anybody, they're like, we want to work extra shifts. We want to work Saturdays, right? We just put us to work. We want to get to work. And so, although I know they could take a few more people, the ones they've got really are highly skilled and are highly engaged in the work. I did not vote for the bipartisan infrastructure plan, but it wasn't because I was concerned about the spending. A lot of the spending in that bill is going to help make the kind of investments that we need in ports. And I think we could do even more of that because you're right. If America is going to continue to grow, those ports are going to be even busier, and thank goodness for that. But another thing I think we need to do is understand that trucking is one of the weakest links in the supply chain right now. We're 80,000 truck drivers short, and those guys can't work a lot more hours, in part because they're working as many as they are allowed under law to work today. And many of them are very safe drivers. I think they could work an extra hour a day and be perfectly safe.
And you've said the same thing on pilots. You've said that we have got to relax that a bit right now.
I mean, the fact that we make pilots go retire really 10 years before the rest of America retires is inconceivable to me. I mean, you're telling me that a 60-year-old guy or gal can't safely fly a plane? I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And we're not quite where Japan and Europe is, but clearly we're on the bad side of a demographic aging of a country, which means we better be focused about how to make the use of graying America to a far greater degree than we've been comfortable doing. And I don't know if that ties into the ports, but it certainly ties into trucking, and it certainly ties into the air commerce as well.
So I want to thank Representative Dusty Johnson, who is allegedly adorable in South Dakota. And I just want to say thank you so much. And I'm going to say that Semafor is going to continue to do a series of events that look at these structural issues in the U.S. economy, and I hope we can continue this conversation. I'm impressed with the depth of your commitment on it, so I hope you'll be back.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dusty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Congressman Johnson. Well, next up, and thank you, Steve, as well. Really hope you're enjoying today's event. Some great conversations going on. Again, please join us on Twitter, Semafor. We've got a hashtag. Naharika, remind me. Fix supply chains. It's easy to remember. Please join the conversation there. And now I want to bring you a word from our sponsor. Please welcome to the stage Tom Madrecki, Vice President of Supply Chain and Logistics from the Consumer Brands Association, and Sean Joyce, Executive Director of the Shippers Coalition. Over to you, Sean and Tom.
Thanks so much, and others have said, who would have ever thought that we would be having a supply chain conversation here at District Winery in the morning in DC. I used to make a joke that I had the least sexy job in town, and supply chain policy is not the thing that normally gets people up in the morning. Maybe that's a credit to the avocado toast, as others have mentioned too. But we're really excited to convene this conversation today. Supply chains are an issue that impact every American every day. The Consumer Brands Association represents food, beverage, household, and personal care manufacturers, the types of products that the average American relies on, by our estimates, 42 times a day at least. I know that in my household we have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. That number is much, much higher. Just from a convenience standpoint, from an affordability standpoint, these are the products that really power the everyday. And really want to also thank Semafor and Steve for facilitating today's conversation, for Representatives Blunt Rochester and Johnson for joining us, and later you'll hear from Representative Malinowski, and well as some folks in the National Economic Council. So really excited about the conversation that we're having today and the focus that's been given to supply chain. Sean is the executive director of the Shippers Coalition. Consumer Brands is a member of that organization. And I think between the two of us, we probably see eye to eye on a lot of the issues that are impacting just the supply chain and how to facilitate that, how to make that undergirding infrastructure of how we get, receive, purchase things, that ensure the availability of those products, how to make that system work better. If I'm explaining the supply chain to someone, I often sort of compare it either to the health of your own body or the health of the economy, right? This is something that we all take for granted, but what you put in is what we sort of get out of it. So the degree to which we invest in it, the way that we nurture it, the way that we take care of that supply chain, that ultimately is then connected to our economic prosperity, to our national security, just to the ability for you and I to go to the grocery store during COVID and get toilet paper or baked beans or whatever the heck we were trying to get. And so the same issues that impacted us then continue to impact us today. The demand for consumer products alone is much higher even than it was during those panic buying months of March 2020. And it's a credit and a testament really to the private sector for stepping up and being able to meet the needs of consumers. But this is not something that can just we can't just go from crisis to crisis to crisis and keep expecting that the private sector comes through and we're just sort of well, thank goodness that we responded to that crisis. Obviously, it's important to respond in those moments, but this is something, an issue that I think we can really get ahead of. And I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, which is, Sean, tell me more about what this next Congress inherits, what's on their plate as we've gone from crisis to crisis. We just got done with some rail strike talks, averted that, thank goodness. But tell me, sort of prognosticate this out a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And as Tom said, Executive Director of the Shippers Coalition, 80-plus members, CBA is a member. We have PepsiCo, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, a lot of food, dairy, agribusiness companies who move heavy goods around the country. And I think some of the themes you've continued to hear today is this is a complex issue. We like to say on our side of the equation, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for this. There's no silver bullet. We work in a multimodal space, and I think, as Tom and I have joked in the past, a lot of the issues we worked on weren't necessarily the sexiest issues. My background is I started my first job on the Railroad Subcommittee, worked for former Chairman Bill Schuster on the Transportation Committee. Those issues I think a lot of folks in this room pay attention to in the business world and the VP and supply chain and logistics sides, but COVID kind of heightened that and demonstrated that there were major deficits in the system. It became front page news. It's something that's talked about day in and day out. I think a lot of us were used to getting things immediately. I know this morning I was upset that I couldn't get a Tide pen within an hour when my son spilled formula on my pants. And so we've taken things for granted. And as Congress is looking towards the next legislative session, I think there is opportunity in a divided government. When there's one-party rule, it's difficult for industry to sometimes cooperate and be able to move things that are favorable to industry. And so from our perspective, what we take on as the preponderance for us is an education and advocacy campaign. Yes, everyone is concerned about the supply chain, but what does that actually mean? How does that impact day-to-day consumers? And what are realistic solutions? And so we talk a lot about things that can happen in the short term. I think the administration in good faith tried to look at some of those items, but there are medium-term and long-term solutions as well. And so our organization, we represent the shippers. We talk a lot about what Congressman Johnson was just talking about with the truck driver shortage. There's a retirement and a retention issue there. We're going to lose over 1 million drivers over the next decade. And so there are barriers to entry as we try and recruit new truck drivers in that space. It's a quality of life issue. I think it was extremely heightened during COVID. There was issues with parking. It's a tough job. And so what are things that industry can do? What are the things that the federal government can actually lean in on that isn't this pie in the sky silver bullet, but doing things like creating a federal grant program. You know, those schools for truck drivers can often cost $10,000, and so there are many other companies and industries that have grant programs like that. That is something we consider low-hanging fruit. I think you can get bipartisan buy-in. You know, another component we work on is gross vehicle weight limits. This is an issue that's been going on since the 1980s, and our coalition has really worked hand in glove with Congress, with the administration, with the previous DOT and this DOT to try and raise awareness as these trucks are leaving the ports, factories, and warehouses 2/3 of the way full. And so if they have the ability to raise the gross vehicle weight limits on federal roads, you can increase the efficiencies, you can reduce the wear and tear on pavement, you can reduce carbon and particle emissions. And so approaching it from a holistic perspective, I think, is the most important thing. But again, there's an education divide. There are 74 new members of the House, 7 new members of the Senate. You know, they hear a lot about the supply chain, but what does that mean besides the toilet paper shortage, the formula shortage? How else is that impacting everyday consumers? And it's upon folks like you and I and everyone else in this room to go out and educate these new members and demonstrate, you know, how this is impacting real-world constituents for them.
Right. Well, it's clear that you sort of need this mix of both almost like philosophical, you know, transformative policy solutions, you know, Representative Blunt Rochester and others in the House working on this idea of an office of supply chain, or building out more of like an industrial strategy to how we approach these issues in America. So you need that overlay of a strategic viewpoint. But you also need very practical solutions, whether it's gross vehicle weight limits, whether it's even just tariff reductions in the short term. Like, how do you take costs out of the equation? How do you facilitate and make things just run smoother? Mm-hmm. You know, the other example of like, if you know, supply chain is in your body, like it's kind of like a, you know, I bike a lot, and you know, a clean drivetrain, or like, you know, being able to just like take some of that friction out, having things run smoothly on time. That's so critical for our economy. It's critical for consumers, and it's something ultimately that we take for granted. We also saw, though, that despite all of the attention that was given to supply chain, despite the fact that it was tabletop, you know, conversation, that it was in front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, this Congress didn't move pieces of legislation forward like Representative Blunt Rochester's. What gives you confidence, especially heading into that divided Congress, that we might see some traction? And talk us through a little bit about it in the minute we have left.
Sure. You know, I think we all recognize that Congress doesn't operate under immediate deadlines. They like to wait until the last minute. We should give credit where credit is due. Congressman Johnson with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, that was a big step in the right direction. We're closely monitoring implementation of that from the administration. But I think there's opportunity with the divided Congress, particularly in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. You know, last Congress, it was an extremely partisan process. It was a top-down driven from leadership. If you talk to future Chairman Graves, and I think to be Ranking Member Larson, you know, they both talk kind of speaking on the same language. They talk about returning the T&I committee to bipartisanship, something that committee has not really operated under in a while. And so I think being able to see a pathway towards bipartisan victories for both sides, that both sides can go home and say they are doing something for their constituents and not in this one-party rule, I think is quintessential to success in this space.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, thank you, Sean, and most importantly, thank you all to our attendees today, the Consumer Brands Association, and I think I can speak on behalf of the Shippers Coalition as well, that we look forward to working with you on these issues in the year to come. We invite your questions to future panelists, but thank you again for joining us today and taking part in this important conversation on fixing America's supply chain.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom and Sean. Well, next up is a discussion on the importance of public and private partnerships to support the American supply chain system in our global economy. Please welcome Mike Keeley, President of U.S. Government Affairs at UPS. Mike is responsible for leading the company's legislative, strategy, and advocacy efforts, and with him today is Cleet Willems, a partner at the law firm Aiken Gump. Up until April 2019, Mr. Willems was the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council and was a key negotiator with foreign governments, including China and the European Union. Joining them is Semafor's Business and Technology Editor, Gina Chon. Gina, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I'm really glad that we have two people who have, you know, been on the ground working through a lot of these issues in reality. So thanks to both of you for joining us. So I wanted to start off with sort of a high-level question, just given, you know, we are in DC. We've had several members of Congress here. And there's been, a lot of rhetoric from both sides of the aisle about business, particularly big business, and whether they are a friend or foe on various issues. The Biden administration, I think, also has had a bit of a mixed record when it comes to working with businesses. So I wanted to ask both of you, how does that color or affect the ability to have effective public and private partnerships? Does that matter, the rhetoric, once you're sort of dealing with hard issues?
I'll start. Politics is politics, and I think people are going to say things. I'll say from our perspective, we have not had a problem picking up the phone and talking to whoever we need to talk to, and whether that be on railroad issues, which was a really big deal for us. I probably was talking to the administration almost every single day, whether it be on issues at the port. Early on reached out to them to say we wanted to sort of help and work on the solutions for the supply chain. And our phone calls were returned, and we had really constructive dialogue. There's going to be noise in the background. That's this town. You got to push through it, no matter who's in the White House.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But let me take your political question in a slightly different direction, because we're here to talk about supply chain problems writ large. And one of my frustrations is that I think politics has actually prevented us from looking at the right solutions when it comes to supply chains. And the one area where I would be critical of this administration, where they haven't engaged, really is on trade agreements. If you want to solve supply chain problems, you need to be engaging with friends, allies, partners around the world, and looking at ways to reduce barriers to goods and services moving between us. And so there's been some rhetoric about friendshoring, but when it comes to the policy itself, we haven't seen any of that in practice. And I think politics is a big reason for that. And there's been some concern about taking on certain groups who have been opposed to trade agreements in the past.
So, Clee, following up on that, you are recently wrote something on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Trump administration had pulled out of, and frankly, Democrats have also not been a fan of as well. So, how do you see the path forward for something like that, given the political headwinds?
Well, first of all, the report I put out this week, it's called Reimagining the TPP. It was something I did on a bipartisan basis with Wendy Cutler, who had a high-ranking position in the Obama administration. And really the whole idea was this. We wanted to prove that you could have a real conversation about TPP. We're tired of this binary yes or no. Let's actually talk about the substance. Are there problems, and how do we address them? Because my perspective, and I think Wendy's as well, is that right now, if you look around the region, you have other countries like China going around, engaging in all these trade agreements. We're on the sidelines. We're not offering real solutions. So the question is there a way to take a real trade agreement model, go beyond IPEF, which doesn't include market access provisions, and is there a way to make that viable politically in the United States? And my view is that it is. And we had broad consultations with folks on the Hill, with folks on the right and on the left. And the theory that we really have here is let's do to TPP what we did to NAFTA. Let's take an agreement that was unpopular. Let's make some fixes to it. And I think if we do that, we can get bipartisan support. And I think that's what we need to solve some of our supply chain problems, as well as to get us in the game vis-a-vis China and others in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, let me
Mike,
jump in on that. I mean, it was funny when trade became a four-letter word, and it really was around TPP, and it was sort of mind-blowing, especially those whose lives, sort of careers are built around trade. We got to step back into it. We really do. There's been an absence of conversation on it. You had a really successful passage of USMCA. People came together. It was bipartisan. Why we can't do that right away with the United Kingdom, with Europe, and with Asia? It just has to get done, and we got to move forward quickly.
Well, and I do want to move on from trade agreements, but in terms of how you sell it, because that seems to be one of the main problems in terms of getting political buy-in. I was at the Democratic National Convention when Hillary was nominated, and a lot of Bernie supporters, they had all these signs with like TPP with a circle and a line against it, but then when you would ask them why they were against it, they kind of didn't know. It just became a slogan. But how do you have a catchy slogan for, you know, TPP in terms of it's
I don't
sort
have
of
a singular
complicated.
slogan, but
Like-
I'll give you three concise reasons. Number one, China. The world has changed. They are aggressive and assertive in the Indo-Pacific. We are on the sidelines. And it's easier for companies right now because of the existing TPP and the RCEP to link supply chains with China than it is with the United States. That's unacceptable. Number two, you have this scenario where we have USMCA. We showed we could do this in a bipartisan way, that we could raise labor standards, we could raise environmental standards, we could fix rules of origin on autos, and I think you can incorporate that kind of stuff into these agreements. And I would say to those environmentalists, union folks, if you really want countries around the world to level the playing field, you actually have to have true trade agreements with incentives for them to do that, and that's what we can do through these agreements. And then the third point is really just the export opportunities for businesses, agriculture, energy. We make stuff in the United States, we need to sell it abroad, and so I think you can sell it on all three of those terms.
Great, well maybe they should hire you as their marketing person. Mike, in terms of lessons learned from the pandemic, just talking to folks from the White House, I thought it was interesting hearing from them just about how much certain companies actually didn't know about their supply chains when these disruptions hit. Like automakers knew about sort of their first tier suppliers, but not sort of their second tier, third tier, and that helped cause more challenges in terms of getting around those bottlenecks. What are the lessons learned, and what do you think still needs to be done to ease some of these issues?
You know, I've had a lot of conversations on supply chain, you know, from the start of COVID, and I think a lot of folks just got used to hitting the order button, right? The old internet button, and all of a sudden your supplies showed up, and whether that be masks early on or whether that be pharmaceutical products. And they didn't understand where it was coming from, how it was getting there, how long it was going to take to produce, what materials were needed, and the complexities of really what a global supply chain is right now. So to me, the most important thing is data, right? And the more data that we have from the front end of the manufacturing process to the final mile of delivery and everything in between is what's going to make us better. 6-7 years ago, we experienced it as a company, and we thought we were great on data. And we had surges, we had bad weather, and all of a sudden, we weren't good anymore for 30 days in December about 7 years ago. And we said, you know what, we got to get better. We need to understand what our customers are doing, how much volume our customers are going to give us. And that is a daily task that we have to do, particularly at this time of year. And when you have that data, you can manage your resources, you can manage your assets, you can manage your people, and you can get your final mile deliveries done on time. And that really is the number one metric for us as a company.
Yeah. And I'm relying on you to get my daughter's Christmas presents on time. Clete, I wanted to ask you, and Mike as well, there seems to be, whenever there's a crisis, like the threat of the rail strike or the pandemic, there's always this rush for the public and private sectors to come together. But when there's not a crisis, what are the mechanisms do you see to have more consistent, regular interaction with the private sector so that you're not scrambling to like, who do I call for this? Or, you know, the ports are backed up. How do we get, you know, the cargo from here to there?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think now is the time when we need to be preparing for the next crisis situation, the next pandemic, the next supply chain crisis. And we really need to put rules in place that govern it so we don't end up exacerbating the problem once it hits. And I do agree that some of that is, as Mike was saying, some of this is information and data and making sure we clearly understand where the choke points really are on the supply chains and what are the mechanisms we can put together, working together, public and private. I'd also look at, you know, are there rules about the things we do when there's a crisis? And one of the things we saw with COVID is a bunch of countries putting in export restraints on the critical supplies, and that exacerbated the supply chain crisis. And then I think there are things we can do domestically to make sure that we do have, we shouldn't onshore everything, but we can create incentives to make sure that in the most important supply chains, we either can do this in the United States, we can do it with allies who aren't going to put barriers in place, and I would go back to sort of what I was talking about earlier on sort of how trade agreements play a role as well.
Yeah, listen, I'll start with the trade agreements as well, and I think setting the rules for trade so that they're easy to understand. Some of that complexity is out of there. I think particularly on the small and medium-sized business side, larger businesses are pretty sophisticated and are able to figure it out and have the resources, but we do need to make it easier for entrepreneurs, for the small and mid-sized company to interact in international trade, because there's great potential there. And then all these supply chain task forces that are out there, we got to keep them going, right? They can't be a one-hit wonder. They have to be real. You know, the power of the federal government in a lot of ways is the ability to convene. You know, when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to the private sector, there isn't, you know, a ton of rules that potentially can be placed on them unless some new laws are passed. But they do have tremendous power to bring people together, to hold people accountable. And when the supply chains aren't working like they should, or folks are falling behind, there's a lot of pressure that they can put on them to improve the service across all facets of the supply chain.
Yeah, it seemed like the port czar, John Picari and other, that seemed like it worked out actually really well.
I thought he was great. I remember sending him a letter saying I wanted to have a conversation, and within 24 hours we were on the phone and we were working together, trying to understand our role that we played with ocean shipping, how we move product for our customers off the ships into warehouses, and then to final destinations. And he wanted to learn. He was engaged. He was fantastic.
Great. I think we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one audience question, if anyone has anything.
Well, nobody else does.
Sure.
We're on camera, so go ahead, Pat.
Clete, I've read some things that you and Wendy put together about trying to do the TPP. Now, when I was on the Senate Banking Committee staff and we saw NAFTA, we saw the ADST provision for the first time. As you know, when Lighthizer redid NAFTA, he took ADST out of it. Do you want to take ADST out of your TPP proposal that you and Wendy are putting together?
Yeah, and you mean
just kind of break down
ADST.
I've got family
alternative
in Carlsville, Oklahoma, watching this. They need help.
Yeah.
ADST is a system where it incentivizes our companies to be able to invest in the other country, therefore offshoring jobs from the United States.
It's investor
As you know,
state.
we've run about. Last year we had $1 trillion
I can answer quickly.
trade deficit in manufactured goods. That's why trade has a bad name in this country.
So we've tried to learn from what was done in USMCA, and I actually think that what we're trying to do is a flexible, bifurcated approach. For countries like Canada in USMCA, there wasn't the ability to bring investor-state disputes. There were some concerns about that. But for Mexico, as we're seeing in real time, there are things going on in their energy sector that we do need to be able to challenge. So what we're recommending in our report is a similar approach where maybe with Singapore, Australia, Canada, we don't need investor state, but with Malaysia, Vietnam, we would include it. And the idea would be to focus on sectors and countries where there's a problem, which we need for our private sector, but not to allow private sector to challenge the government on their right to regulate more generally.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Keeley, Mr. Willems, and thank you so much, Gina. Our next guest, Congressman Tom Malinowski, is a member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and an active proponent of strengthening America's supply chains. His term in Congress is coming to an end this year, and we hope he's going to use some of his time to be a little candid with us today. So I'm very pleased to welcome Steve back to this conversation. Thank you so much.
And let me tell our friends in the back, Harry Broadman and others, there are seats up here in the front. Feel free to come take them. And I also want to just say for those of you right now, we have a special treat coming up in a minute, right after my conversation with Representative Malinowski. We're going to close the program formally, close the program on video, and then we're going to have a conversation on background with two of the most important people in economic policy from the White House National Economic Council. That'll be on background. I am swearing all of you to respect the rules, that this is on background, no attribution, no reporting of this, because it is important that they have agreed to come over to have a thoughtful, quality conversation with all of you, but I want to respect the rules that we have. And Thelia, it's great to see you. Tom Malinowski is a friend, and I've been privileged to know him for many years. He is an extraordinary force in global human rights standards and norms. I did not know, candidly, Representative Malinowski, that you were an obsessive about supply chains and resilience in these systems. So can you, I mean, we've got about another week left in Congress, and you have served, you're going to be leaving Congress. What should we be doing this next week while you are still there, and even afterward, to seriously address in non-trivial ways the supply chain crisis in America?
Well, thanks, Steve. You all heard from my colleague Lisa Blunt Rochester. She and I, with Adam Kinzinger, tried to pass the supply chain resiliency provisions of the America Competes Act, and we have been trying to get some of that done in the last few weeks of Congress. I'm not super optimistic given how little time is left. But we do need, in my view, to build on the CHIPS Act with a much more ambitious set of measures to secure supply chains, not for, I don't particularly care if folks can't get their lawn chairs delivered from China in 48 hours, but things that are critical to our national security and to our economic security. I think we've learned some big lessons.
What would be some of the things
years.
on those lists that you do think are critical?
Well, microchips obviously is the big one that we've dealt with, but I would say anything having to do with energy security, anything having to do with our transition to clean energy, battery technology, the critical minerals that are required to pursue that transition. Ordinarily, I might not care about getting solar panels from China, but when those solar panels are linked to slave labor in Xinjiang, and when we have, I think dictatorship is a market failure. Mm-hmm. I'm a believer in free markets and free trade, but I don't believe that we can trust the dictator of China to do what is in the economic self-interest of China. And if there is a war in Taiwan, if there's another crisis between the United States and China, I don't think it is safe for us to be dependent on supply chains that begin in China for things that are critical to our security. Pharmaceutical ingredients. Almost all of the ingredients that are used to manufacture antibiotics in the United States come from China. Again, imagine a scenario where China invades Taiwan. Do we want to give them that leverage if we make the choice that we are going to make to defend Taiwan? You can believe in free markets and free trade, but the reality of the world is that there are these market failures where governments pursue interests that have nothing to do with their economic self-interest.
I mean, you have this quote that covers some of this. You say, we've learned many hard lessons during the pandemic. Among them, we should never be dependent on strategic adversaries like China for the goods we need to keep America safe and secure, whether it's PPE, whether it's protecting from disease, chips that power cars, computers, cell phones, so on, key materials in electric vehicles and solar panels, all of this stuff. You said that's what this bill was enabled us to do. When I looked last, and it's not all of the high-tech componentry there, but our trade with China is about $650 billion in two-way trade, I believe. And it's a staggeringly large amount, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I guess my question is, the shift in that, I mean, what's realistic in terms of turning the ship and bringing so much more of that commerce and production and manufacturing back to the United States in any real way? Because it is a huge number, and it would be, if you did bring that back, it would be an enormous economic input, I suppose, here, but I'm also looking at labor shortages in America, stress, etc. How do you do it rationally?
Well, in politics, we usually talk about bringing those jobs back to the United States. The reality is we can't bring all of those industries to the United States. We do need to think in terms of a coalition or alliance of countries that share our values, where we can have trust across frontiers that those countries are not going to screw us in a crisis, to be very, very blunt.
Right.
And so we are talking about North America, not just the United States of America. We are talking about Europe. We have some issues with the European Union right now that need to be worked out with respect to the energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think there are some legitimate concerns from our European partners there. But I do think, look, we have to buy ourselves as much time as possible to do this. We are, in a sense, in a race against time. I come back to the potential for a crisis between China and Taiwan, which might bring the United States into war with China. We hope it never happens. We hope we have time, if it does happen, before it happens, to secure as many of our critical supply chains as possible. But there's no time like the present to begin. You mentioned one other thing. You mentioned the labor market challenge. And again, this is something we do not talk about enough in the political sphere. Politicians love to talk about creating jobs. The infrastructure bill, I campaigned on millions of new jobs that are going to be created by the infrastructure bill. The CHIPS Act, obviously, the IRA, bringing all of this clean energy manufacturing back to the United States. What we very rarely acknowledge in the political sphere is that we just don't have enough people to do these jobs in the United States. And there are only two possible solutions to that problem. One is scientists figure out a way to grow workers in less than 18 years. The second is comprehensive immigration reform, and going back to the vision of America that used to be shared by Democrats and Republicans like Ronald Reagan, that we are a place that is open to those with dreams and visions of living a better future and freedom. And we have had almost a complete shutdown in immigration to this country because of the Trump administration's policies and then the pandemic over the last 5 or 6 years.
So is that a blind spot of the Biden team that they haven't fixed that?
Well, I think they would agree with me.
Why are they moving so slowly?
Congress, right now, there is a total and absolute block in the United States Senate, courtesy of one senator, Charles Grassley, of any provision in any bill related to anything having to do with immigration. Even things that you think Republicans would be in favor of, like I've got legislation that would make it easier for people fleeing the Chinese Communist Party from Hong Kong to come to the United States. It would be a few thousand people. I can't get that done. The Afghan Adjustment Act. Republicans criticized the Biden administration for not doing enough fast enough to help Afghans who are fleeing the Taliban, and yet they refuse to allow us to pass that bill because of an ideological
This is even
block.
people that are translated, the SIVs.
Everything.
Right?
No, there is simply no category. There's no provision related to immigration that can pass this ideological blockade.
Right.
And that even applies to a few hundred people, a few thousand people, to actually get the immigration reform that would enable millions of people in the United States to work legally who are here now. The number one thing, by the way, we could do to cure inflation would be immigration reform. It's politically almost impossible. And so one of my missions in life, which I hope all of you will help with, is to make immigration an economic security issue again.
Is that your next chapter?
I have no idea what my next chapter is.
Okay.
Well, we all need to be part of that chapter.
Well, great. Well, let me. I'm going to take a question from Harry Broadman, who we had talked earlier about this, but we're going to make this a quick question, quick answer. Go ahead, Harry.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted you had this meeting. I'm one of these few people who has been obsessed about supply chains and logistics for 2 or 3 decades. I was the lead U.S. negotiator for the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which probably none of you remember, but that governs the trade and investment in services.
Right.
And that brings me to the point I think we should underline in this conversation is it's not just the pandemic that has engendered this issue, right? The industry has been changing. And one of the issues, someone mentioned about pushing a button, you expect your goods. One of the issues, I'm an economist, right? So I think about in terms of pricing, is are we pricing things correctly?
Right.
Are we sending the right signals? So should we be willing to take a greater discount if it took a week for Amazon to ship you something as opposed to tomorrow? So these are fundamental issues, not just related to the pandemic.
Right. Thank you, Harry. Comments on this, and one of the things that Harry just said about pricing is when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s, and I think it's around the time I first met you, for Jeff Bingaman, there were senators at that time, there were people like Clyde Prestwitz raising big questions about trade dependencies, about institutions and global governance on trade, China and its course. And I have to tell you that everything we raised back then was roundly ignored by the Clinton administration in the middle of this. And I kind of look back at who's liable for the circumstances we have today. And I can name names and make a list. and they were Republicans and Democrats where we're at now. And I'm just interested in whether or not, as we look to fix this, this has been baking for decades to come to Harry's point. So my question to you is, you know, as we talk about this and try to be responsible, should we be even talking about quick fixes? And we'll make this the final question.
About quick fixes? I mean, there are no quick fixes. In a way, the quickest fix is what I was just talking about. That is actually the quickest, most consequential thing we could do to deal with inflation and supply chains. Because we have this massive workforce here, which is undocumented, and you know, desperate to become taxpayers, desperate to become fully fledged American citizens contributing to our country, and many, many more waiting in the wings. Going back to, you know, I was in the Clinton administration. I wrote President Clinton's speeches arguing for bringing China into the World Trade Organization. And
I remember them.
Yes, they were great speeches. Look, there was a gamble that was based on the idea that if you bring this country into a rules-based system, that it would change, and that turned out to be false. That turned out to be not true. There is a broader mistake I think we tend to make as Americans dealing with dictatorships around the world. We project our own rationality onto them. We assume that just as we would not utterly destroy our own economy by doing something crazy like invading a country in a way that would break all of our international relationships, that Xi Jinping would not do the same thing. Look at what Putin just did with respect to Ukraine. It's economically irrational, but it is rational from his point of view as someone with a messianic sense that I'm going to rebuild the former Soviet Union. And I think we have kind of begun to come to terms with that a little bit more, like recognizing that, yeah, China could do what Xi Jinping clearly wants to do to Taiwan, despite the economic consequences, and therefore we have to be prepared.
Well, can I just say on behalf, Congressman Tom Malinowski is going to be retiring from Congress in just a few days. Can I just say thank you for always coming when I ask for your friendship, your leadership, and I know you will not be stopping on a lot of these topics in your next chapter. So Tom Malinowski, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.